Good evening, all of my listeners. Thank you so much for joining me in another episode of The Village Witch. My name is Avalon, and I am your hostess for this evening. I'd like to start by offering my sincerest apologies to everybody about how long it has been in between recordings. Things got kind of crazy there around Halloween, and I didn't... for whatever reason, I wasn't as crazy inspired as I usually am. I didn't have a topic in mind, and I had too many topics and no topics all at once, and it was very confusing, and I just couldn't pick one. And I went through a couple of weeks where things just felt heavy, but I am back, and we are continuing our shenanigans, as it were, on our mythological creatures anatomy this week. We would be remiss if we missed our favorite Gorgon, the fair Medusa. So that is the topic of today's discussion. Medusa. In Greek mythology, she is the Gorgon we know the best of the three. There is also, let's see, I'm going to quote GreekMythology.com. I know that's a fairly pretentious website, but it seems to be doing pretty good. Medusa, whose name probably comes from the ancient Greek word for guardian, was one of three Gorgons, daughters of the sea gods Phorcys and Ceto. The three sisters I'm gonna completely butcher this, people. I am terribly sorry. Greya? I don't know. I'm just gonna call her G for now. Greya, maybe. Echidna and Ladon. All of Medusa's siblings, monsters by birth, and she was not. She, as we all should know, was... arguably the most popular version of this story is the one where she is taken advantage of by the god Poseidon in the Temple of Athena. There has been some debate over the consent behind this act. Some say that she was making love to him, and many others say that she was completely taken advantage of, and whichever one you believe it. I hear the one the most where she was taken advantage of, but because it was an act of sexual transgression against Athena in her own temple, Athena, a virgin goddess, or so they claim, she turns Medusa from the beautiful, entrancing maiden that she is known to be into the Gorgon that we all hear of, the snake-haired, stony-gazed Gorgon that everybody fears so much. She, in many versions of mythology, is just a woman with hair of snakes and a gaze that will turn anyone to stone. There are versions of this myth that say that it's only men that she turns to stone. And there are versions of this where she is half woman, half snake with hair of snakes. We all probably by now should know my stance on the half human, half animal body type, but we will get into that shortly because I am still mad about centaurs. Because my thing is, I'm always the kind of person that goes, okay, we were telling these stories, we were telling these myths as people long before we had any knowledge of one, human anatomy, before we had any real knowledge of human anatomy, but also long before we had any other sources to draw upon. Now, a lot of people like to go through life saying that there are no original ideas. I think that's crap. I think that through history and culture, we see different cultures around the world coming up with original ideas all the time. So it's not unrealistic to think that the mind of a storyteller could have fabricated this creature and it became part of the legends that stuck around in Greek mythology. Part of the myth. But a lot of inspiration, especially in Greek mythology, a lot of it doesn't just come from nowhere. We see it in one place and it evolves from there. I have always been the kind of person that goes, well, if they're telling stories about it, there must have been something back then that made them tell these stories. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with my anatomical correctness argument, is perhaps either the creature itself or something like it existed. People make this argument all the time for unicorns and dragons, and that they were unearthing dinosaur bones back then. They were just walking along their stone paths or whatever, and they were coming across dinosaur bones. And that's not an unrealistic thought with all of the excavation we know now that the Greeks and the Romans did. But back then they weren't sitting there going, oh look, it's an apatosaurus. No, to them that's a fucking dragon. So, taking into consideration the fact that there is probably something inspiring the story of Medusa, we know very little about her actual life. We know she was supposedly taken advantage of in the Temple of Athena, where she is then found out and turned into the monster that everybody claims that she is. And then we know the end of her life. We know that she is slain by the hero Perseus, and that's kind of all we get. So, like, what about the rest? That's what I want to know. The heck did this woman do with her time, aside from sit around in a cave and wait for people to show up and turn him to stone? I mean, we need to think about it subjectively. Medusa, although her sisters were born gorgons, they are born monsters, she was human, and she lived among humans, as far as we're told. We don't know anything, or at least we don't know too much about her from before the time that she's turned into a gorgon. I don't know why I insist on doing these so late at night. So, just to make sure we have as many facts as possible, I'm going to go ahead and find her on her wiki page. Don't come for me, I Wikipedia things all the time. Medusa in mythology. 3 sisters, Medusa, Stheno, and Uriel, children of the ancient marine deities Phorcys and Keto. Thank you to Wikipedia for having those spelled out phonetically. Genealogy shared with the sister whose name I could not pronounce. Anyway, ancient Greek painters, carvings imagine Medusa and her sisters having monstrous form, yada yada yada. We all know this. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything on her childhood and her life after becoming a gorgon. So, like, here's where my argument begins. We are now faced with the myth that at the time would speak to the reality of such a creature. I mean, the way I imagine myths being handled socially back then is kind of like how we as humans, specifically Americans, because I don't know if anybody outside of the Americas listens to this podcast, specifically Americans, how we handle cryptids. And by cryptids, I mean the chupacabra, the squonk, the skunk ape. I mean, cryptids are essentially myths, and, you know, we have Bigfoot, we have our own mythical creatures, and we call them cryptids. Back then, I'm wondering if they were kind of handling myths about Medusa and her sisters and the Nemean lion. I wonder if they were handled the same way. So I have to wonder. The snakes in her hair, we know that they are living, hissing snakes. How do they operate? Okay, do these snakes, because they're just like the middle of a body protruding out of a head. It's not like they're just whole snakes coiled around her head. I mean, these things are connected to her. Is she handling the blood flow to all of these snakes, or do they all have their own little individual hearts? Is she handling the thought of these snakes? Is this like a hive mind thing going on with her and her snakes, or do they all have supposedly different brains and therefore their own personalities? Do they ever bite her? Does she get bitten by her own snakes? These are questions that I have absolutely no right to ask or ponder to myself. And the reality of me asking these questions is because they are 100% open to interpretation, I think. And I see fan art for Medusa all the time because, let's face it, we are still geeking out about Greek and Norse and Egyptian and other mythologies in the 21st century. It's 2021 and we are still freaking out about these stories. That's how good they were. So this is 100% open to interpretation, but I am asking the questions. If she is the half-snake body that she is sometimes depicted with, how far down does the snake body go? I mean, if she turns a guy to stone, what does she do for prey? She's not eating these men. She's, I don't know, stone gardening or something. Excuse me. She's probably got a hobby that she does with her statues. And the snakes, does she feed them? Or do they just parasite off of her? And if so, why are they not located in an area that could potentially garner more body fat? Because let's face it, the skull is not a very nutritious spot, skin and muscle wise. There's skin and muscles and blood vessels there, but I mean, it's practically jerky. So how are these snakes still alive? Does she lay around and feed mice to her snakes one by one? Can she speak with them? Do they have thoughts? You know, we look at, who was it? We look at Hermes and his caduceus, and in a lot of modern depictions of him, the snakes coiled around the caduceus are sentient. They have thoughts and voices. They're very personified. And while this may not be true of depictions of Hermes back then, it certainly has evolved to be that way. So are her snakes the same way? And I like to think that maybe they do have their own personalities. I feel like she wouldn't be so lonely. I don't know. I could sit here and ponder Medusa's snakes all day. But I also have to ponder, again, if everything she looks at turns to stone, how is she herself getting nourishment? We know that she can look at herself in a reflection. Can she, put on like an eyeglass of some sort and go and look at things without them turning to stone, or does she have to just straight up sneak up on everything? I mean, imagine not being able to look something in the eyes for the rest of your existence. I mean, no wonder she's so angry. And this goes back to the intent behind her being turned into Medusa. A lot of the time what we hear is that she was completely taken advantage of. She was going to pay her respects to Athena in Athena's temple and was basically attacked by Poseidon, who we all know is no better than his brother Zeus, except Zeus somehow manages to gain consent a little more often than Poseidon does. I'm not saying he gets consent all the time. I mean, the Greek gods were very stereotypical patriarchal men. When you look at the original text, there was not a whole lot of room for consent in their lives. Throughout Greek mythology, this tends to be a theme, so we're just going to brush over that fact because I know it can bother some people, and I am not here to do that. But in the versions that I have heard, and there certainly are versions that are told where she is having a legitimate consensual affair with Poseidon, I still don't think anyone deserves to be that lonely all the time. Not that I can pass judgment on the actions of a goddess, because, you know, we're all here, we all worship different people, and those of you who worship Athena, no offense intended. I just think I don't know, I just think that nobody deserves that kind of loneliness in their lives, no matter what they did. But I like to think of the best in people. And, you know, going back to what Medusa's life could have looked like in the in-betweens, because all we know are, you know, how she was created and how she died. And we know we have a bit of comprehension. That's not even the right word. I have no brain tonight. We have some stuff that comes after what happens with her. We know that Perseus mounts her head on his shield and goes and saves Andromeda. And let's see. The blood of Medusa spills all over the place. It says, according to the Ovid, which is a person. Ovid is a person. A Roman poet who lived during the reign of Augustus. Contemporary of the older Virgil and Horace. Often ranked as one of the 3 canonical poets of Latin literature. Okay, so he's right up there with Virgil and Horace and Homer. So this guy says, in northwest Africa, Perseus flew to the Titan Atlas, who stood holding the sky aloft, transforms him into stone when Atlas tries to attack him in a similar manner. The corals of the Red Sea were said to have been formed of Medusa's blood spilled onto the seaweed when Perseus laid down the petrifying head beside the shore during his short stay in Ethiopia, where he saved and wed his future wife, the lovely Princess Andromeda. Never states that she is a princess in Ethiopia. That is actually very, very interesting, because that changes a lot of things that we know about the myths. I love that so much. Said to be the most beautiful woman in the world at the time. I love this so much. Says, furthermore, the venomous vipers of the Sahara in the Argonautica, Ovid's Metamorphosis, are said to have grown from the spilled drops of her blood. The blood of Medusa also spawned the Amphisbaena, or a horned dragon-like creature with a snake-headed tail. Perseus then flies to Seriphos, where his mother is being forced into marriage with the king, Polydectes, who was turned into stone by the head as well. Perseus then gives the Gorgon's head to Athena, who places it on her shield. So he went and did all this stuff without even putting it on the shield, and I think that's worthy of note, because in every version of the movie of the acts of Perseus, I mean, every clash of the Titans ever brought out, he mounts it on his shield after it's given to him by Athena. So, you know, Hollywood deserves a little bit of leniency because it's Hollywood, and of course artistic license is there for everybody to take. But I mean, not only is she taken advantage of and then lonely for the rest of her life, she is then mutilated and used as a tool. I think that's just harsh. Harsh for somebody who, before all of that, was supposed to be excuse me, a very sweet woman. But apparently things didn't end after death for her, which, you know, you can almost imagine. It says the blood of Medusa spawned the Amphisbaena, or the Amphisbaena. I'm going to go ahead and click on that. We'll get a good look at that. Yeah, so that's the illustration where you've got the dragon with the wings and the head of a dog, and there's the long curling tail, and the two heads are looking at each other. It's actually quite a beautiful drawing. It's an interesting creature. But again, it's said that this Gorgon, this woman who was turned into this snake-like stony-eyed monster, is now spawning a snake-headed dragon with her blood. You have to wonder if this is some form of evolution, or if her blood attracted the creature and it wasn't yet known. I mean, if we're thinking of this in realistic terms. Of course, in mythology it is perfectly understandable and acceptable to believe that a creature would be born of blood. This happens very frequently throughout not only Greek mythology, but religious mythology in general. Blood is a very important substance. Blood does pretty much everything because blood is life. I think it also mentions later on that she has children. Yes. In most versions of the story, she is beheaded by the hero Perseus, who is sent to fetch her head by the king Polydectes of Seriphos, because Polydectes wanted to marry Perseus's mother. Gods are well aware of this, and Perseus receives help. We know this. He receives the mirrored shield from Athena, and sandals of the golden wings from Hermes, the sword from Hephaestus, and the helm of invisibility from Hades. I love how this, by the way, is one of the very few, or not even the few, one of the many, now that I'm thinking about it directly, one of the many instances where you see Hades being literally the only decent Greek god out there, but I will get to that in another episode. Since Medusa was only one of three Gorgons who was the only one of the three Gorgons who is mortal, Perseus is able to slay her while looking at the reflection in the mirrored shield. We know this very well. During that time, Medusa was pregnant by Poseidon, but never had the chance to have the baby. When Perseus beheaded her, Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, or Chrysaor, a giant wielding a golden sword, sprang forth from her body. Jane Ellen Harrison argues that her potency only begins when her head is severed, and that potency resides in the head. She is, in a word, a mask with a body later appended. The basis of the Gorgonian is cultus object, a ritual mask misunderstood. Interpret that how you will, but it was beautiful. And I mentioned that Ovid, the writer who talks about her in his poets, is up there with Homer and names are not good, Virgil and Horace. Homer being probably the one we know the best. He is known for writing the Odyssey, never specifically mentions Medusa. It seems like a lot of the poets at the time are less poets in their own right and more the artistic interpreters of acts that were happening at the time. Because a lot of this, the Odyssey,